Hey, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, the world's a better place because you're in it. You see what happens when you subscribe? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to the one and only Stephen Robinson. He is a compliance officer with a lot of great background, a lot of great stories, and he has a really cool approach of being hard on the problem and easy on the people. And he talks a lot about how that has generated so much more effectiveness, so much more collaboration within his organization. So I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts. So glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I've been excited to get you on. We had a really cool pre-show that we probably should have just recorded in and of itself because that was like a podcast. But I'd love to just kind of start just diving right into your career journey and philosophy. Like, what led you from being an assistant DA in Manhattan to now having this career in compliance? Because I think that was some interesting overlap there, you know?
Sure, not exactly a straight line. And the last step was simply being told I had responsibility for providing legal support for the compliance team. So I can't say that being an ADA in Manhattan led me to be a good person to support a compliance team, but I did learn some lessons there that I use every day. And the first one of them is facts matter. The compliance mission is the same every day. You must do what the law requires of you. You must do what your contracts require of you. You have to comply with your own policies. And it's the facts that matter. It's the factual scenarios that change what your gaps are and where the problems are. And that's very much like criminal prosecution. The elements of a crime don't change. You can look them up. It's the facts and the admissible evidence. If you have proof, you have it. And if you don't, you don't. And if the facts add up to compliance, you're in compliance. And if not, you have a gap. Facts matter is an important lesson. And you get the facts, I think, by asking very simple questions. What do you do? What did you see? Those kinds of things. For lawyers, that's sort of direct examination 101. That's the first thing you learn to do. But that's how you get the facts. And I think the second lesson is that individual points of view really matter. There's someone in every organization that knows an aspect of that organization's operations better than anyone else. And if you want to provide good compliance advice, you have to elicit the information that everybody has. Even if they don't have it in a clearly articulated talking point, you have to find out what they know. Why do they know it? If someone's being quiet in a group discussion, is it because they really have nothing to add or because they're intimidated somehow or they don't feel free to speak? And until you know all the facts, you can't really provide proper legal support for the team, and you can't really help them identify compliance gaps and how best to close them.
I mean, it's such a simple thing, right? I mean, you're saying, hey, you got to start with the facts. The facts matter. It's simple but profound. I guess that's like sliced bread, right? I mean, sliced bread is a pretty good invention. All it is slicing the bread. To your point, though, like in order for one to digest that advice, you have to bring a certain objectivity and you have to sort of divorce yourself from like some assumptions you might be carrying with you to really see what the lay of the land is, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the assumption that you know it because you're the lawyer is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Lawyers, they're not terribly popular with business people because it's, I'm from legal and I'm here to help. And people think I'm about to hear someone wagging their finger at me and telling me you're doing it all wrong and you must stop. And,
right.
and the best lawyers are sources of solutions, not problems. And so the way to reframe those concerns is how can we work together to solve this problem or to understand this problem?
Yeah, that resistance is almost like, to your point, taught in business school or something. So it's like, if you're a lawyer or you're a compliance person, you have to assume that you're sort of starting from, a little bit behind the starting line, so to speak, or you're starting in the hole a little bit. Do you find that that's a difficulty, or is that really an opportunity to shatter that misconception of the other person?
You have to show it. if you tell people I'm not that kind of lawyer, they'll say, well, show me. And so you have to show them.
Yeah.
And you can show them. And I think the way to do this is to say, look, what are you worried about? Because it's really not me being on a call. It's really not the compliance team suggesting that some policy or some practice has to change. It's really not knowing whether what you're doing all day long is really compliant or not. It's the not knowing that causes the concern. And that's why, as we spoke before, talking with the compliance team is always good news. When you ring off a call with the compliance team, you will know more. If it's good news, it's good news. If it's bad news, you can hand off your compliance gap to the compliance team, and we will come back to you. And we will come back to you with the solution to the problem. And so the real nightmare scenario, the regulator, the litigation, the huge fine, whatever it might be, will never come to pass. And that's why whenever you talk with the compliance team, it's a good day.
So that frame, I want that on a t-shirt. You know what I'm saying? Like that should be the battle cry of compliance, because for exactly what you're talking about, like to actually do our job, to actually de-risk the organization, it takes an authentic sort of collaboration with these other counterparts who are in position, like who were in a position to just help, right? Why is that so tough? Why is it so tough for that phrase? Anytime you're talking to compliance, that's a good day. Why haven't we embraced that? And why isn't that the sort of like average stereotype across organizations, do you think?
I don't think people are crazy about change. So if when things change and you can't do whatever it is you've been doing, the way you've always been doing it, I think people get very nervous about that, and they think the risk of change will be greater than the risk of persisting in whatever it is they're doing.
Okay.
And they may not be wrong about that. There may be unintended consequences of some change you have to make to close a compliance gap. And it's not that they're wrong about it, but you need to tease it out and put it in perspective and find out what's really the problem. I don't think that most people who have compliance problems cause them. I think they encounter them. They go to work one day and the law has changed. They haven't done anything differently. The policies haven't changed. The needs of the business haven't changed, but the law has changed, or the regulations have changed. And I do a lot of work in privacy. We talked about that too. The pace of legal change in the privacy world is rapid. There are new laws coming online all the time. Some of the legal requirements are changing in ways that will cause operational change in businesses that use personal information every day. So that's nobody's fault, but it does have to be managed and it does have to be navigated. And the tone with which you show up makes a huge difference. It's not, you have to stop what you're doing. It's like, we're going to do this together. And,
right.
I know I listened to some past episodes of the podcast. I know you're a parent. I am too. So the analogy that I like to use is crossing a street with a child. The child needs the guidance and you need to guide them. So you're going to take the child's hand and they're going to offer their hand and you're going to cross the street together. And it's natural, and they're entitled to your guidance and you're entitled to their cooperation, and across the street you go. And so business goes on free of any of the really sort of nightmarish compliance risks that an organization might otherwise encounter.
Yeah. And I like that analogy also because over time, that child shouldn't need my hand to cross the street. Over time, they should learn how to cross the street and where to look. And that's going to come from some of my instruction and some of my modeling and stuff like that. Yeah.
Not the same street. I hope this isn't too New York City, but there'll be a different street. You're a block of this and this. And so, and that's part of it. So it's a cliche that, compliance is a process. And of course it is. And there's a human dimension to that. And you have to bring, I think, a certain humanity to the way you approach these compliance discussions. Everybody has to be heard. Everybody is an expert in some aspect of the organization's operations. And if you're going to lead a compliance team or even provide legal support for a compliance team, it seems to me you've got to find a way to elicit all those points of view and make sure they're all considered in your approach to the problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's probably even more important today than it was maybe 40 years ago. I mean, today we're like squarely in the knowledge work economy where we are our work. The assets in our economy are largely human beings. And so their compliance, which is always going to be voluntary unless you're at a jail, maybe it's still voluntary at jail. I don't know. Maybe in the gulag. I don't know. But like, it's always voluntary. So like you have to get that collaboration and you have to bring that humanity to the work, to your point.
Yeah.
You said something in our pre-show that's really stuck with me. And it was your approach or your philosophy is about being hard on the issues and not on the people. Why is that mindset so resonant and so effective? And why is that lacking so much, do you think, in some other programs?
I don't know. That is the way I think about it. I think about approaching this work as being hard on the problems and easy on the people. And it's sort of code for me for a little bit more accessible and a more everyday formulation of the notion of building a culture of compliance, because that sounds like it should be all, in all capital letters somewhere. Right. And it's very intimidating. Building a culture of compliance sounds a lot more complicated than it is. But being hard on the problems and easy on the people is, I can turn to everyone I need to speak to and say, how does it work? Explain it to me. And then I have my questions. It's, well, if that's true, shouldn't this other thing be true? Yes and no. And who do we have the right people on the table? And if you don't know, who does know? And so eventually what you do is you make the circle bigger until you're talking with every stakeholder who understands some aspect of the problem. And everyone is respected and heard because everyone is an expert in their particular area, whatever aspect of the problem they know best. And so you're being hard on the problem in the sense that you are investigating every aspect of the problem. You're developing a comprehensive, shared understanding of the facts of the problem. But you're being easy on the people because no one is being stepped on, nobody's being ignored, nobody's being told you have to do it some way that's uncomfortable for you. We're doing this together. So that, and to me, when you start having dialogue that works in that way, you start building the culture of compliance without making it sound like we should all eat more vegetables. Although we should all eat more vegetables.
We all should. Yes. It's so interesting though, right? Just enabling people to be part of the solution as opposed to trying to find a villain in that room as that circle expands. It really does lead to a lot more effectiveness, I imagine. Because I think that self-preservation is what prevents people from engaging, and it prevents people from pulling compliance in sooner because they don't want to get in trouble or whatever. So in doing that, you end up building a lot of trust, don't you?
It's true. And, I know you've had this discussion with prior guests, and I thought there were great discussions in other episodes about how the notion of there are good people and bad people in the organization, and you have to figure out who's who, is a little reductive and simplistic. Of course, there are people who just want to do what they just want to do. Of course, there are people like that, but they're rare. Yeah. Most people are trying to do the right thing, and there's some misunderstanding or miscommunication, or there's been a change, and it may be a change that wasn't communicated to them or clear to them, and they just want to do the right thing, and they need some help to get there. So I guess the way I think about it is, if you make everyone part of the solution, nobody has to wear the black hat. Nobody has to be the bad guy. And you can also approach it with the notion that this has happened to them. Not quite that they're victims, but something has happened, and you've got to help them navigate this change in whatever their role is.
Well, and I think you actually believe that, because the way you talked about it initially was really about, people are not necessarily doing things wrong. Sometimes the rules just change, and they've just done what they did yesterday, today. And I just think bringing that kind of grace to these kinds of discussions leads to a lot more engagement. And it leads to, probably compliance being viewed more as a source of good within the organization, and people getting closer to that ideal that you talked about, where how did you put it? Any day that you talk to compliance is a good day.
It's good.
You have to your point, you have to create that. They have to feel that if they're going to believe it.
Yeah. And if there's anything that So there are going to be miscommunications and there are going to be misunderstandings. And you need to take, let's put it this way. If you're leading a team here with this attitude, you're always the source of the problem. I didn't get it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't get it. And you can reframe resistance in this way too. I mean, you are going to be, at the end of the day, you are going to be asking people to change what they do. If you have a compliance gap and somebody has to, beep when they should have bopped or something like that, or something has to change, you are asking that of them. And people don't like change and there will be some resistance, but you can reframe it as, look, of course you're concerned and your concerns are valid, but I think I heard you to say that you would absolutely never do this. I must have misunderstood. Because if I'd understood you correctly, that would mean you want to continue to do something that's going to force the organization out of compliance. I'm certain I misunderstood. Where did I go wrong?
Right.
And so if it's my misunderstanding and not the other person's resistance, I think that melts things away. There are all kinds of other things to do. It's like you point to people as having appropriate concerns when they do. So resistance is, you're so right to raise that with me.
Right.
We have to make that part of the way we formulate a proposed decision to tee up to management.
That in itself is an important reframe. That when I'll just speak for myself. Sometimes when I'm pushing an agenda or I'm pushing a change and I'm met with resistance, I think my gut reaction is to get a little frustrated by it. But to your point, if I can reframe that melts away any contention, and it really, and I can view it more objectively to see, well, maybe this is a valid concern. Maybe this is something I didn't consider, or if nothing else, this person whose compliance I need, which is going to be voluntary, they probably have to at least feel heard in order to give me that.
Exactly. And so I can hear you in the wrong way, because I must be wrong to hear you saying that the only acceptable course of conduct is something that will take the organization out of compliance. Surely that's not what you meant. I must have missed your point.
Right.
What's your concern? What are you worried about? Because
and that tears away. That gets down to this core issue that's at the root, Yes.
And there's nothing you're worried about that can't factor into the proposed solution. We're going to go to management and we're going to say, look, we found a compliance problem and here's what we recommend doing about it. But there's no recommendation that we're going to make without exploring whatever your concerns are and without addressing
them. So that's a really strong strategy to kind of do this thing that you're talking about. What other strategies do you have to make compliance be viewed as the bearer of good news, even in the context of these difficult situations at times? Is it just kind of going slower and just kind of bringing the humanity to it? Or are there specific additional sort of specific things that you just kind of run through a certain algorithm as you're kind of having that type of a conversation?
I think the other thing that I bring to this and that I think has been helpful for me is the notion that we are where we are and we can have to evolve from here. So it's not wrong or bad. There's no fault, there's no blame, there's no political points to be scored. We are where we are and we move upward from here.
Right.
So we assess where we are accurately now. We figure out how best to move on. We understand that we didn't get into whatever the current compliance posture is overnight. We won't get out of it overnight, but we will take orderly steps in an orderly way that will close compliance gaps. And the evolutionary thing, I think, also helps make people approach these issues more calmly in a more accepting way and see compliance as a source of more positive news. It's not wrenching, immediate, unplanned, unscheduled, unbudgeted for change. It's evolutionary change. You will solve this problem in as quickly as the circumstances of the business permit.
Yeah, I think, what's that saying? It says comparison is like the thief of joy. And I think it's easy to compare yourself to somebody on Instagram or compare yourself to some write-up about a compliance program that showed up in Compliance Week or something like that and be like, oh my gosh, they have it all together. There's no, integrity issues at that company. I mean, if you liken it to kind of climbing a mountain, which is what I always view any sort of creative, difficult endeavor to be like, you're ostensibly saying, man, I should be higher up this mountain than I am. But to your point, wherever you're at, that's where you're at. And if compliance,
you'll
go
take a
ahead.
step and you'll be higher.
That's
And
right.
you'll take another step and you'll be higher still.
And if compliance, quote unquote, isn't some ideal that we're truly never going to meet, but it's still an ideal that we should pursue, well, then it shifts it from the black and white of am I in bounds and compliant, or am I out of bounds with like a crappy program, to a mode of continuous improvement.
Yeah. And right, exactly. So there's something else. It takes courage to approach it this way.
It does take courage. That's right.
And when you're asking business people to grapple with a change in this way, to look in a searching way, be hard on the problem, we're going to sit on this call until we have a shared understanding of our problem and how we're going to respond to it. That takes courage. It's easy to say, I'd rather do something else. I have a report I can do. I have a timesheet to fill in. I have something simple to do, and I can just keep doing what I've been doing. You've been doing it for however long. It's never been a problem. Why would it be a problem today? Why would it be a problem tomorrow? That's easy. So it takes courage to sit there and figure out, how are we going to do this better? How will we evolve into the new circumstance? And I think conspicuous praise, expressions of gratitude, saying thank you to people when they point out problems, when they say, well, the way you formulated that's not quite right. You really need to consider something, some other aspect, whatever it is. Saying thanks for pointing that out. That's an important observation. Just those kinds of things, I think, generate a much more positive approach to compliance generally.
The picture that you're painting is one of courage. It's one of kind of, pardon the term, but kind of being a gentle protector in the organization. Approachable. I'm here to help. This is, you're not going to like touch an electric fence coming over to my office type of a thing. And I think that can really build a lot of trust in the organization. And my question is, how do we multiply that out? How do we multiply that out across the team? And how do we keep that kind of confidence to where people, like, your guard has to be down a little bit to take, negative feedback or criticism about a plan you're rolling out. And I think that can send a signal to other people in that room or in that meeting that, okay, wow, we're really trying to get to the answer. It's not just Steven pushing his agenda, right? How do we multiply that out across the team? Is it just merely modeling it enough for other folks on your team to say, okay, I should show up how Steven does? Or is it more explicit than that to say, hey, this is our philosophy, and for us to get the engagement we need with the rest of the organization, we have to show up this way? Is it kind of a mix? It's probably not one or the other.
To me, I think it's largely a matter of beginning with the end in mind. What's the work product for the compliance team? So we have to assess compliance gaps as they arise, as we understand them. And then we have to recommend to management some sort of plan for how to respond to the change. And I think the goal of the compliance team is to make sure that management never runs a compliance risk in an unknowing way. That's what, and maybe this is the way lawyers approach this sort of thing. We're advisors. We don't make business decisions. We tee things up for clients and for management to decide. But to me, that's part of the compliance team's job too. You find a compliance gap. You figure out what your recommended approach to closing the gap might be, and then you suggest it to the decision makers, whoever they might be. They will decide, and your job is to make sure they don't make a decision without a full understanding of the problem and the consequences of not addressing it fully. And then they'll do what they do.
Right.
And so the work product of the team is make sure that we are in a position to inform management fully from beginning to end, not the result. That's what management is there to do. We are there to understand, to communicate, to recommend, and then the decisions that get made.
Yeah, compliance officers get themselves in a lot of trouble or cause a lot of trouble for themselves when they don't have clarity around that scope. Like you were just very clear around, about the line around what's on your plate and what's not on your plate. And I think when we start eating food off the table instead of the food off of our plate, we can kind of get ourselves into some situations. Have you encountered any scenarios where there was some confusion, either from your team or from other counterparts in other departments, in terms of like what's in bounds and what's out of bounds for compliance?
I have seen miscommunications, and they're almost always about getting away from the facts of a specific compliance problem and wandering into areas that are a little bit more subjective, like ethics or culture or things like that. And I think there can be a real disconnect between business decision makers and compliance people about ethics. Because from the point of view of the people in the C-suite and the people on the board, they have a different ethical calculation to make than we do on the compliance team. Our job is, again, to understand, communicate, and recommend. Their job is to return value to shareholders or the owners of the business. And they have to make that, they have a fiduciary duty in many cases, right? That's part of their calculation. That's really not part of the compliance calculation. And so when you talk about wandering into other people's areas of responsibility and eating food off the table and not off your own plate, that's a source of confusion that I've seen, reasonably frequently.
Yeah. That's pretty pervasive. That's a pretty pervasive sort of miscommunication. That's a word you've said a lot, communication. And I think the thing I was struck with in our pre-show and, in the anecdotes that you've, shared with us on this recording is your focus on effective communication. I mean, at the end of the day, it seems to me 90% of conflicts in work and maybe in life are due to some kind of a miscommunication. And so I think I love your focus on effective communication. And I'd like to talk a little bit about like body language, because we communicate so much with our body language and, it's easy to not pay attention to it. So I'd like to talk about what role body language plays in building rapport and trust in these kinds of compliance conversations, either in the context of a tough issue that you're talking about or just kind of meet and greet or like relationship building within the organization.
So when you were asking me about this, I told you I didn't really know very much about body language, and I don't. I have had the experience, and I've been a technology lawyer for a long time, and I really love this technology. I love that we can have this call in this way. But I've also had the experience that face-to-face meetings in a room are much more effective than Zoom calls when the chips are really down and when you really need to have a difficult conversation. A face-to-face conversation with a real person is better than this. Anyway, I think people know when they're being listened to and they know when they're not being listened to. I think one of the reasons that people get nervous when people on Zoom calls are off camera is they have no idea what they're actually doing, where their attention is. And so as long as you can find a way to indicate to someone that you are legitimately interested in what they have to say, their point of view matters, their perspective on the problem matters, how to address the problem from their perspective matters, and that you are concerned not to cause some sort of completely disproportionate disruption to what they do already, right, I think you're going to be okay. I think a lot of body language and a lot of those sort of social cues gets lost in online communications. Yeah. And I regret that, but it's also a fact of life now. I don't know how successfully return to office is going to work post-COVID. I really don't know. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. But to me, if you want to support a compliance team in the way that we've been discussing, you've got to find a way to make everybody on a call, whether they're on camera or not, feel listened to, feel like an expert in their area of expertise, make sure their point of view is expressed, understood, and considered. So synthesizing all of these things is part of the compliance leadership role, and certainly part of the leadership council, the compliance council role.
Yeah, I've been saying this a lot lately, or maybe forever, that I just find this game that we're in to be so interesting because there's such a melding of different skills that are necessary to be effective. It's not just, hey, this is the right technology or this is the right way to do a conflicts of interest disclosure program. It's about getting people engaged with the risk management apparatus that you're managing. And I think
Right.
to your point, when people don't feel hurt, like think about any relationship that any of us have where there is that really strong foundation of trust. It's always a function of you feel like that other person knows you and you feel like you know them. And there's an authentic connection there that's built on that trust, and it's built on the other person or feeling like that other person understands you. And when you can pause in the moment to get that buy-in and tune into somebody's engagement, or make them feel heard, or make them feel like they're an expert and that their considerations and concerns are part of the formula, I'm sure it just knocks down a lot of walls and helps you move so much faster. Although it might seem a little slower on the front end.
It does seem slower on the front end, and it's entirely worth it. And it's so if you don't do that, what ends up happening is you come up with some solution that really doesn't work because you've left someone out.
Right.
And now you've got to go back and start over or redo or revise, or you had some very reasonable objection made late in the process, possibly in front of a decision maker, because you didn't take the time when you were formulating your understanding of the problem or your approach to resolving it to consider everybody's point of view.
Right. So when you're talking to C-suite, how do you tailor your communication style so that it resonates with these diverse audiences? When you're talking to C-suite or when you're talking to frontline folks, do you find yourself showing up in different ways? Are you putting on a different level of, executive presence or approachability depending on the audience?
I do, and it's because the goal of the communication is different. With frontline employees and with people on the compliance team, I'm trying to gather and synthesize the information to have the discussion with the tone and the approach that we've talked about, making sure I understand every aspect of this problem, that I understand exactly why we're proposing whatever it is we're proposing, and why I think it will close whatever the compliance gap is that we've identified. When it's time to go to the C-suite, I think you can be a little bit more forthcoming about what the consequences of not closing this compliance gap really look like. What have other compliance actions look like in this space? If you don't respond to it, what are we lining ourselves up for? This stuff can be very scary if you talk about it. If you talk about it with line employees, because it sounds like if you don't help me right now, we'll be looking at a multi-million-dollar liability and being the subject of some frontline press report or something like it. And that's not consistent with a respectful hearing of the problem. But the C-suite needs to know that.
Right.
You must advise them, and you must advise them of what the downside is. And so I do think you have to show up differently, and I do think there's a difference in approachability, and I think that's appropriate.
Yeah, and I would imagine when you're talking to C-suite, they're not just going to take, if I was in your C-suite and you came to me with a recommendation, I'm not just going to take it. I want to understand how you arrived at that. And to your point, when you've had those conversations and you've built those bridges, so to speak, and you've taken in all those considerations, as that executive starts to press on that recommendation, you have a whole foundation below that of reasons why and, additional considerations that make that recommendation so much more well-baked.
Agreed. And the same is true for the C-suite person.
Right.
They know things I don't know. They know things that are above my pay grade too. And so is the business about to change in a way that makes the solution that we propose disproportionate or inapplicable because we're about to exit a business?
Right.
Are we compliant, or the business is going to change in a way, or we're going to have a vendor to take care of this. And so instead of managing this risk ourselves, we're going to shift it to a vendor. There are all kinds of things that a C-suite person might know that the head of a compliance team might not know, or counsel to a compliance team might not know.
Right. You mentioned the sort of post-COVID era that we're in right now and all these changes going on with the workplace and returning to work. What do you think is the biggest challenge or opportunity facing compliance professionals in the next couple of years?
So I think it is all the things that people have to learn, but I think that's also a tremendous, it is a challenge, but it's also a great source of joy and satisfaction. Uh-oh.
Go ahead. I'll fix it.
Oh, okay. So, there's a lot to learn, and there's been a lot of change, and there are many new things to consider, but that means that every day is a chance to learn something new. And I think that's really a wonderful opportunity for compliance people. We're not doing the same thing every day. We're doing whatever compliance requires of us every day. And so, as businesses change and grow and technologies evolve, there's a new opportunity to learn something. So I think that's great. I also think that this is also sort of maybe an odd thing for a technology lawyer to say, but I think there's sort of a risk to be managed when we talk about automating compliance processes. People who are used to doing a manual process, they know why the steps are the steps. They know why the order of the steps is the order of the steps. And if you automate the process so that all you know is you push the button and something happens and there's an automated workflow, and then you replace the person who knew the manual process with somebody who knows just to push the button. If there's ever a problem, and there probably will be one day, a problem with the automated process, the knowledge of why the steps are the steps, why we take these steps, why we take them in this order, can be lost. And so I think knowledge transfer is an important part of automating processes. And I think a lot of that can be lost. So I think that's a risk.
So what you're saying is that as we sort of rely on technology more, there's some kind of, there was in my dad's generation, everybody knew how a car worked. In my generation, nobody can fix their own car. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of that type of risk. Like, you don't know how the machine actually works. I just know I plug my key in or I press the button and put my foot on the gas. And when something goes wrong, to your point, I need to rely on somebody else. I can't sort of fix that myself because I don't have that knowledge. That knowledge has been sort of lost.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And we're all end users now. And so what do we want as end users? We just want it to work. We don't really want to get under the hood.
Right.
Sorry, more car metaphor. Anyway, sorry. We don't want to know how it works. We just want it to work. We want it to work now. And the issue with the end user mindset and compliance is that if when things go wrong and you just want it to work, now the discussion that we've been talking about, how do we figure out what this problem really is? What does this mean for our organization and how would we address it? Becomes much harder. We have to relearn all this. Right. And in order to relearn it, we have to slow down. And that makes change harder. That makes the organization less nimble. That makes compliance cumbersome and disruptive to business, and more disruptive than it has to be if this knowledge transfer that I'm talking about happens when and as part of automating the process.
And who do you think that's incumbent on? Is that incumbent on the leader of those end users? Is it on compliance to make sure that there is that understanding and that knowledge transfer is not lost as something is automated? And I'm kind of struck with this image of someone standing at the foot of a broken escalator and being like, I don't know, I can't get up there. The escalator ain't working. It's like, well, it's stairs. You can walk up those stairs.
Right. But now what you've done is you've sort of, the escalator is a great analogy because you can still get where you're going, but now it's step by step. Right. And it's slower and you might trip. Mm-hmm. Just getting on an escalator, it's pretty straightforward. So, I don't know who it is in every organization, but every organization that's thinking about automating a process has an internal champion. There's somebody waving the flag, automate this process right now. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask, how will you accomplish the necessary knowledge transfer so that we understand what it is we're automating? Right. And the next question has to be, and how can we help you do that? Because if it's you have to do this for us. Now you're starting to break down trust and cooperation. It's sort of this is important, and you're not in it alone.
Right.
And so, the knowledge transfer, this is a shared burden. Of course, all the efficiencies that come from automation, we're all for it. Let's just make sure we understand what we're doing, so that 6 months, 2 years, 5 years from now, when the automated process is all everybody knows and everybody in this role has moved on to something else, we know why we're doing what we're doing.
I mean, how much bigger is this risk we're talking about with AI? It might be like an order of magnitude higher risk.
Yes. And particularly when you're talking about technology that hallucinates, that fabricates.
Yeah, great point.
I'm using Claude almost every day, and I've taken to modifying my prompts to say, don't give me any fabricated and hallucinated result.
Smart. That's a smart sentence for every single prompt.
And then if it tells me something, it's like, great, cite your source.
Right.
And one of the reasons I like Claude is that it's very forthright when it comes back and says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have told you I had a source for that, because I don't. And great. But to your point, if we're headed toward a world where there's AI in everything, and you don't know as the compliance professional whether the result you're getting from the AI powered compliance solution is accurate or not.
Yep.
Do you know where you are? How can you tell where you are? Is there going to be sort of one AI tool checking on another? There are questions of reliability and validity, and it's early days for AI, and I think it will get better. But I think that's an issue. Yeah.
And I think it's the EU AI, initiative or whatever that came out recently. That kind of, I'm getting these words wrong, but they kind of like outlawed or frowned upon situations where AI is making the decision without human intervention, right? Like if AI, the policy or the guidance is to say, well, the AI shouldn't make that decision for an applicant tracking system, for example. That shouldn't be sending out, declining interviews or, kicking somebody out of the process on its own. It can give those recommendations, but a human needs to go ahead and press the button to kick that person out of the process, right? But to your point, that guidance presupposes that the human being is going to, with fresh eyes, actually objectively weigh that recommendation. But as time passes, and to your point, as AI infiltrate, just think back 9 months ago, the adoption of AI was a fraction of what it is now. 9 months ago, everybody wasn't using Claude every single day. So I'm just saying, as we sort of implicitly begin to rely on it more, that guard we have against, hallucinations or whatever starts to drop significantly. And I think that guidance can sort of be without teeth very, very, very soon. You know what I mean?
Sure. And particularly since nobody's doing one applicant. They're doing hundreds of applicants.
Great point.
And there's more and more to do. There's more and more to do all the time. So what is the real value of that human interaction and a human making a decision? If the human is basically ticking a box to say, yes, this is what the AI told me to do, and I agree with it, I agree with you. There's not a lot of value there. And the mistakes keep happening.
I know.
Ineffective human interaction. I think one of the first AI horror stories that hit the press was a lawyer filing a brief generated by AI with fictitious citations in it. Just happened again last week.
Did it for real?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Because that was like a famous story.
Yeah, right. It was a famous story, and this is your point. The more work there is to do, the more sort of.
Yeah.
The question is how will you build a culture of compliance in an AI powered world that tells people, something, if you look at a recommendation from AI and you think as the compliance professional that this is wrong or incomplete or distorted in some way, you can stop and figure it out using exactly the processes that we've been talking about. I don't understand this. Explain this to me. How does it work? I don't understand. how did you get here?
Right.
Simple questions. Because I think I derive tremendous value from asking that. And as simple a skill as it is, as you said, it's kind of amazing how few people will reduce the question to that sort of simple level.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a first principle type question. You know what I'm saying? To gaining understanding, you know?
It's all too common for attorneys to talk past people.
Yeah.
It really is. And it's just a mistake to do it. And simple questions get you past that. One of my former colleagues had a rule about no unexplained acronyms. That's important too.
Yeah.
Making sure that everybody has a shared understanding means conducting these discussions in a way that breaks down all the jargon, breaks down all the acronyms, all the technical language till you know, as the leader, as counsel or as the leader of the compliance team, until you know that there is a shared, clear understanding of the problem and how you intend to address it, or recommend to the C-suite to address it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can explain string theory to a 5-year-old. It's not going to be as detailed as it would be if you're explaining it to a room of PhD students. You know what I'm saying? But you can boil things down. You can zoom in and out of things, to your point. And if the goal is not just getting the words out and moving on to the next meeting, but rather that clarity and that true understanding with those other counterparts, well, then you have to develop that ability, to your point, to like zoom in and out of different layers of detail in order for that person to be able to digest it. Like sometimes you got to cut a steak up into small pieces for a little kid. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. And you can always follow up. If there's some item of detail, there's some nuance you think you're missing, you can always follow up. You can ask another question.
Right. Yeah. And then again, if you've done those things, if you've built those relationships and, you know, sought clarity and all those kinds of things, that follow-up conversation is not going to be contentious or guarded or cagey in most cases.
Because you build trust.
Exactly.
Throughout the whole discussion, what you've done is the reason I'm asking these questions is not because I'm going to report you HR. It's because I really honestly need to understand this problem from your perspective. I need to understand what you already know. And sometimes people don't know what they know. This is what I mean. Sometimes it's not articulated. It's like, well, you seem to, what's the unarticulated assumption that you have to tease out of a person who really knows a great deal, but doesn't really know what they know?
I mean, it's literally one of the most powerful questions that you can ask. To build trust and to drop somebody's guard, the question of, something that you just said, how do you see this problem from your perspective? Or I'm interested in understanding your perspective on this problem. What's someone going to say about that? They're going to share. They're going to share it. Right. You finally given them the floor and the forum to get out what's, in the front of their mind,
It's true. I think I've derived a lot of value using this approach, and I made people feel good about addressing problems that initially seemed very hard and difficult to address.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of the theme for this episode, being hard on the problems and easy on the people. When you do it right, you naturally start to ask these kinds of questions, and you naturally start to bring people into the fold, so to speak, and become part of the collective problem solving, as opposed to the finger pointing and the demonization that can sometimes happen in some of these tough conversations.
Yes, and as you make the circle bigger to include all stakeholders who have a perspective on the issue, you also sort of melt away resistance, because now everyone's been part of the solution. Everyone's had a hand in figuring out what this problem really is, how we're going to address it, how we're going to resolve it, and it allows you to do some things that I've done to reframe resistance as appropriate concerns, and to give people credit in a conspicuous way that makes it very hard for them to resist the change that you ultimately think has to be made. Send an email to someone, say, thank you, this has been a great discussion. You were a tremendous help, and we understand whatever the problem is and how we're going to address it much better. I'm very grateful for your participation. Copy their manager. That person is not going to resist you when the time comes to make a recommendation for how to solve the problem.
Well, I mean, you're kind of proving, you're demonstrating And to the extent that kind of compliance is a performative art in some way, you're demonstrating that you have that person's back. That's a big deposit into the relational bank with that individual.
Yeah, and being willing to give all the credit to the people who help you discover the problem,
right,
and figure out how to address it. They're the
You know-
people. I mean, and they deserve it, because they're the people who are exhibiting the courage to say, you know what, we're not going to keep doing what we've been doing just because it's easy and just because we know it. We're going to do something different because it's in the best interest of the organization. And here I've had my part in figuring out what that's going to look like.
Yeah, I think to build trust, you have to have a very low like self-focus factor. You have to have a true others focus. And I think in order to do that, you can't be in that sort of defensive self-preservation mode, right? Like those two can't kind of exist at the same time. You can't be defensive and curious at the same time, for example. And I think your ability to show up that way opens the door for a lot more opportunities to pat that person on the back or to thank them for their contributions. And it seems like when you're in that self-preservation mode, or when I've talked to people who have felt at times that they're in the hole, or they don't have the power that they need within the organization, or they're worried about showing value and all those other kind of things that can turn kind of toxic and reinforce this otherism within the organization. I think when we can when we can move beyond that, it just creates such a different vibe. It creates such a different culture and such a different approach. Where does that confidence in you come from? That confidence to say, I'm adding value here. I don't need to make sure that like, I came up with the idea. If this other person came up with the idea, I can give them credit. That obviously is like the more healthy way to go through it. But it's also like almost like an ascended master's way of going through it. It's like an actualized way of going through it, where you're not sort of concerned with those base risks or whatever.
Well, I don't think of it. Sorry.
That's okay. We can get a special guest here. That's fine.
Yeah. It was too much to hope for that Sam was not going to photobomb this. Thank you for putting it that way. I don't think of it that way. I'm just curious. One of the great things about being a lawyer is that everything is a world unto itself. Absolutely everything. And so I've had an opportunity in the compliance realm to find out things about hazardous substance labeling and import-export, and that I had no idea existed. Trucking over international borders and between states, things I didn't know existed. And if you're honestly interested in the problem, it's not so much, it's just curiosity.
Right.
It's just it's my job to figure out how to support this team. I can't do that without learning the facts. But if you're honestly interested in what the facts are and the points of view of the people who are on the team, to me, this is very natural. And in my experience, when I've had these discussions, there's been a lot of humor. There's been a lot of people were relaxed. People were happy to say what they knew. People were happy to learn new things from other people on the team. This is really the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
That this level of fear and sort of, compliance is here to afflict us and make our lives more difficult. It's really not. And I think, I think that real fear, and I don't, can't speak for anyone else, but I think the real source of that anxiety, as I said, is not knowing. You don't really know whether your operation, the operation you're managing, is compliant or not.
Right.
Nobody said anything to you. Nobody's bugged you. You haven't heard from a regulator. And that means one of two things. Either that you're in perfect compliance and that's fine, or you haven't gotten caught yet. And that's not so fine.
Right.
And so to me, resolving that anxiety is what the real resistance to compliance is about. And when you show up and you say, we're going to help you with that. And the minute you start working with us, the minute we start figuring this out together, the risk of the really bad thing happening begins to reduce, and it goes away. And it will go away as we evolve better and better solutions for the compliance gaps we see.
Man, what a great episode. We're right at the end here, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us. We didn't even get to talk about any of the privacy stuff because you were just, I kept kind of taking us in other directions, but I really enjoyed our time together. And I'd love for you to share where people can find you and where they can learn more about you.
Sure. So I can be reached by email at stephen@stephenhrobinson.com. And I think I gave you other contact information for the webpage for the episode.
For the notes, yep. Yeah, we'll share that.
Nick, this was a lot of fun. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, man. Great guest. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Care.